Throughout the ages, there have been great empires and civilizations that have risen up, their creators ruling nations, regions, and continents for hundreds, even thousands of years. Some of the great legacies and accomplishments of these empires may be lost in the mists of time, but from what they have left behind in rock and ruin, we can trace remarkable stories.
China is one of the world's most ancient civilizations, along with the Babylonians, Mayans, and Egyptians. There has been official documentation of Chinese history for more than 3,000 years.
It is a success story of population movement, economic expansion, technological advancement, all in one. They typically view other people being less civilized to show how civilized they are. They use outsiders as a reference system to actually praise themselves. You know, we're different. We're the people leading civilization.
For 3,000 years, a handful of dynasties ruled China, sometimes for centuries. And in between, warring tribes battled for control of this ancient land. Throughout it all, only the Mongols were invaders. But now, in the 17th century, it was the Manchus from Manchuria who would seize power.
The Qing dynasty lasts over 2.5 centuries. In its heyday, it was one of the world's most powerful empires. Manchu Qing Empire remained probably the most organized and effective and powerful of the medieval age. But the world had moved on. It didn't really do quite so well in the modern context.
The Manchu dynasty, known as the Qing, would, against expectations, in less than 100 years, become the last empire in China's long imperial history.
One country, two system model. You have the Manchus and some of the other nomadic people being put under one system, and a different system being used for the governing of Han-populated China. And for the Han-populated China, they basically recreated and strengthened the system they inherited from the previous Han Chinese dynasty, the Ming dynasty. So your imperial civil service examinations, your use of Confucianism, they were all being integrated into the system. And yet, at the same time, you have the Manchu system still in place. And the Manchu emperor at the throne would perform both roles. So you will have the emperor becoming himself a learned Confucian scholar and able to govern in the Confucian way, and yet also ride on a horseback and take his arrows out and go shooting and riding with his bannermen.
The Forbidden City in Beijing is China's most historic landmark, rivaled only by the Great Wall. It was built in the 15th century by the Ming dynasty emperors when they moved their capital from Nanjing. But the newly installed Manchu emperors carried on the tradition. The Forbidden City served as the home of emperors and their households, as well as the ceremonial and political center of Chinese government for almost 500 years.
The Forbidden City is a picture of the universe. It faces south, so it's protected from the north at the back. And the imperial halls of audience for guests, according to the guest ritual, come to be given gifts by the emperor in a series of audience halls. And then behind the audience halls is the interior part of the Forbidden City, which is where the concubines and the eunuchs lived.
Constructed from 1406 to 1420, The complex consists of 980 buildings, covering 72 hectares. Entering from the Meridian Gate, you encounter a large square pierced by the meandering inner Golden Water River, which is crossed by 5 bridges. Beyond the square stands the Gate of Supreme Harmony. Behind that is the Hall of Supreme Harmony Square. A 3-tiered white marble terrace rises from this square. 3 halls stand on top of this terrace, the focus of the palace complex. The Hall of Supreme Harmony was used by the emperor to receive officials and was built by Emperor Jiangxi in 1695. It is the largest of the Forbidden City halls and the largest surviving wooden structure in China. The Hall of Central Harmony is a smaller, square hall used by the emperor to prepare and rest before and during ceremonies. Behind it, the Hall of Preserving Harmony was used for rehearsing ceremonies and was also the site of the final stage of the imperial examination. All 3 halls feature imperial thrones, with the largest and most elaborate one being in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. The Forbidden City was declared a World Heritage Site in 1987 and is listed by UNESCO as the largest collection of preserved ancient wooden structures in the world. As in the Ming dynasty, the presence of eunuchs in the Chinese court here was a tradition. These emasculated men served as palace menials, spies and harem watchdogs throughout the ancient world. An army of eunuchs was attached to the Forbidden City, primarily to safeguard the imperial lady's chastity.
Eunuchs actually started to become popular after the Mongols, not before the Mongols. So you wonder whether this is really Chinese practice. I wonder whether this actually was introduced from other parts of Asia by the Mongols. Yeah, so the Ming eunuchs and the Qing eunuchs are known as, the best time of the eunuchs, but certainly not before the Mongols. The purpose really is to control the blood purity of the harem of the emperor. Also, because women cannot operate in the marketplaces, eunuchs can, because they have male sort of appearance. They can go to the market, they can buy things, so they have certain freedom. But yet, by surgery, removal of their genitals, they are completely harmless to the harem. Therefore, they have no threat to the succession of the emperor. That's the whole idea.
The eunuchs were even forced to carry their castrated private parts in containers around their necks to prove their status. The queue was a specifically male hairstyle worn by the Manchu from central Manchuria, and it was now forcibly imposed on the Han Chinese under threat of death. The hair on the front of the head was shaved off above the temples every 10 days, and the remainder of the hair was braided into a long plait or queue at the back. Large numbers of Chinese were outraged. The traditional Chinese hairstyle was to wear hair in a bun. It was a core part of the Han Confucian identity.
The wearing of a queue really was just a long-established Manchurian practice. Bearing in mind the Manchus were a nomadic people. They lived most of their life on horsebacks. They were a very martial people. So if you were constantly on a horseback shooting arrows or fighting with cold weapons, if you can have your queues that you can tie up, it's just so easier to manage your hair.
The Manchu rulers gave the Chinese a choice. You either lose your head, or you actually follow our hairdo. So for the male population, if you do the Manchu way, then it is your personal announcement that you actually agree with the Manchu rule. Simple as that. So everybody quickly, to save their heads, they start to do these pigtails.
And foot binding, a custom of breaking and tightly binding the feet of young girls in order to change the shape and size of their feet, was continued, although the Manchu didn't practice it. Bound feet were considered a status symbol and a mark of beauty. Feet altered by foot binding were known as lotus feet, and the shoes made for these feet were known as lotus shoes.
The foot binding really is practiced in the Yellow River region. The reason seems to be that you have a very long winter, and the growing season is about 120 to 150 days of the year. So you don't really need women as a workforce on your fields. Therefore, they don't have to go out to really work for their food. Whereas in the Pearl River region and the Yangtze River region, you do. I mean, women will be used as so valuable to bind their feet. That's crazy. It's kind of a self-inflicted injury, to make yourself disabled, to show that actually the head of household is a man of resources, can actually support you for the rest of your life. Of course, it's brutal, but it's such a twisted picture, of the Chinese mind.
It has been estimated that by the 19th century, nearly half of all Chinese women may have had bound feet, rising to almost 100% in upper-class Chinese women. It's thought the feet of young women were bound to raise their marriage prospects. However, foot binding was also a painful practice that limited the mobility of women, resulting in lifelong disabilities, not least in pain and discomfort while walking. Just as the Ming emperors had done, the Qing adapted to many traditional Confucian ideas. The Qing emperors would come here to the Temple of Heaven, an imperial complex of religious buildings built in 1420, situated in Beijing. Temples dedicated to moon, earth, sun, and good harvest have exquisite decorated interiors. Here there would be annual ceremonies of prayer to heaven for good harvest. The pinnacle of the event happened once a year, before dawn on the winter solstice. Thousands of officials in horse-drawn chariots would make their way towards the ritual site, the round altar. It was here that the emperor, the son of heaven, acted as intermediary between heaven and earth.
The emperor of China was historically presented as the son of heaven, and therefore that connection with heaven was important. It's if you like, a Chinese version of the divine right of kingship.
The most spectacular building here is the Hall of Prayer for Good Harvests, a magnificent triple-gabled circular building, 36 meters in diameter and 38 meters tall, built on 3 levels on a marble stone base. The building is completely wooden with no nails. The original burnt down after being struck by lightning in 1889, and the current building was rebuilt several years later. The high point of the Qing Empire was during the 18th century, when the Qinglong Emperor ruled for 59 years. This period was called the Chinese Enlightenment, and the emperor compared to England's George III, who was on the throne at the same time.
In 1712, the government basically announced that from today onwards, the total revenue will be capped. Total revenue, regardless of the growth of population, the growth of farmland, the growth of the market. Meaning, we don't want to tax you, we leave you alone. So that's a mistake, that's really a mistake. But this certainly agrees with Confucian teaching of benevolence. You shouldn't tax people heavily. So that's why the Qing government taxed the population so light. My calculation is for ordinary unskilled labor, you only pay 3-day wages to the government for the year, and you're done. I quite like that. Nowadays, I pay over 30% to this government.
In the West, everything Chinese became very fashionable. The ruling classes of Europe, such as here in England, erected Chinese buildings such as pagodas on their estates and decorated their palatial homes with chinoiserie.
The Enlightenment period in the 17th, 18th century in Europe, you have people who seem to have a strong awareness of China. I mean, Leibniz, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and their views of China range from, in the case of Leibniz, being really fascinating and admiring of Confucianism, which he heard about via Jesuit missionaries, to Montesquieu kind of calling China the ultimate kind of despotic, kind of autocratic, dictatorial government. And I wonder whether 300 years on we're any further. I mean, has our debate moved on very much? Western views of China today are still very polarized. But I think Chinese views have always been, ironically, I think better informed. So, I mean, that's a sort of, I guess, an indication that Chinese, certainly kind of the elite in previous dynasties, did think it was worth knowing about the outside world. And I think it's often not been reciprocated.
But in the 18th century, the West was intrigued by Chinese methods, such as imperial examinations, a system for selecting candidates for the state bureaucracy. The concept of choosing bureaucrats by merit rather than birth started early in Chinese history, but using written examinations as a tool of selection started in earnest during the 9th century. By the time of the Qing dynasty, the system was highly regimented, with students locked in cells for days doing the exams, which promoted a common knowledge of writing, the Confucian classics, and literary style among state officials. The examination system played a significant role in tempering the power of hereditary aristocracy. The highest degree, the Xinxi, became essential for the highest offices. As many as 2 to 3 million men a year took the exams. The failure rate was 99%. In the second half of the 19th century, European countries adopted the Chinese selective methods and modelled their own civil service exams on the Chinese system. Over time, high-powered civil servants became known as mandarins. Near the end of his long reign, China's Qinglong Emperor wrote to English monarch George III, "Our ceremonies and codes of law differ so completely from your own that you could not possibly transplant our manners and customs to your alien soul. We have no use of your country's manufactures or the lonely remoteness of your island, cut off by the intervening wastes of sea." China's population in 1800 was 380 million, whereas Britain's was 10 million, and Beijing was the world's largest city. The Grand Qing, as it was known, became the 4th largest empire in world history. During the peak of the Qing dynasty, the empire ruled over the entirety of today's mainland China, Hainan, Taiwan, Mongolia, Outer Manchuria, and outer northwest China.
After 2,000 years of this private ownership land, every Chinese is a potentially expert of farming, generations experience. It's not, born with you, but it's in the family. Nobody was hungry. By and large, nobody was hungry. This is the reason why all of a sudden the population double itself, triple itself, quadruple itself. It must be a reason. You can't do this in a poor country.
By the 19th century, the Qing court was sophisticated and cultivated a massive bureaucracy. But as the decades passed, peasants and workers began slipping into poverty. Guangzhou, in the Pearl River Delta on the Chinese southern coast, had long been the entry port for foreign traders. They were fascinated by the wealth of China and marveled at the giant pagodas they saw there. Said one, "The Chinese have such a vast supply of silk that they squander gold leaf on silk flags so huge they can be used as sails, when we use cheap colours and coarse linen cloth." Porcelain was regarded as white gold. In the 17th and 18th century, the Dutch imported 43 million pieces. The Qing initially continued the Ming philosophy, viewing trade as tribute to the court. However, increasing economic pressure finally forced the Kangxi Emperor to lift the ban on private trading in 1684, allowing foreigners to enter Chinese trading ports like Guangzhou and allowing Chinese traders to travel overseas. But soon, this would lead to tensions that would change life in China forever. At the centre of the conflict, there was the British East India Company and its quest for China's most precious commodity, tea.
The East India Company is founded in 1600 with a royal charter from Elizabeth I, and it's a group of London merchants who are given the monopoly on British trade with Asia. Only the East India Company could carry British tea into the country. The Chinese trade was strictly regulated by China, so we had to move gold and silver to China to buy this precious drink.
As demand for tea in Britain increased, the East India Company started to run out of silver and gold, which was needed to trade tea with the Chinese. They discovered that the Chinese were consuming opium, which they believed was good for them. So the British traders exploited the situation and began to smuggle huge quantities of opium, which was grown in British India, into China, then traded opium to the Chinese for their silver and gold.
They have a huge barge there as a storehouse. And you have small ships run by the Chinese smugglers coming to your barge and unload the opium, and then they supply the network of opium consumption inside China. A huge operation.
And eventually the Chinese lose patience and start to confiscate the opium, and that leads to war with Britain. The Chinese were terribly protective of tea. They didn't want people to know what it was or where it was grown.
During the 19th century, the Opium Wars started because at that time, Britain has a huge demand and appetite for Chinese goods, so silks, teas, porcelain, that all the upper classes are consuming at a huge rate. We can perhaps even think about this as a certain kind of dependency, whereas China, by contrast, had no need for any of the produce that was being marketed in Europe. Essentially, the only thing that Chinese wanted and what would agree to trade in was silver and gold. It goes to show that, in a sense, that was China's self-sufficiency. That was a threat, in a sense, to Britain, and it's Britain's own dependency on China that also became problematic.
In each of the two Opium Wars, the European forces used modern military technology to easily defeat the Qing forces. The British discovered cannons in Qing fortresses, which were 150 years old and no longer worked. The Qing had to open treaty ports, especially Shanghai, that handled trade with the imperial powers and ceded the sovereignty of the island of Hong Kong to Britain.
It was just the idea that the mightiest empire in the world would have to cede even an inch of its territory to another imperial power. That was the problem.
After these humiliating losses, downtrodden people began to see Qing rulers as corrupt and weak. The country was ripe for rebellion.
I blame the Qing government to be too idealistic. They went all the way to practice benevolent rule of Confucianism. So to such extent, they just disarmed themselves. To run an empire larger than China today, the Qing authority only hired 27,000 officials on its payroll. You need more than this to run London today. Yeah.
Nanjing today is one of China's most modern cities, but it's also one of its ancient capitals. And just a few years after the Opium Wars, it was the site of an even bloodier conflict that would become another festering wound for the Qing dynasty. The Taiping Rebellion was commanded by Hong Xiquan, the self-proclaimed brother of Jesus Christ, who sought the conversion of the Chinese people to his own bizarre version of Christianity. The Taipings gained control of a significant part of southern China, eventually expanding to command a population base of nearly 30 million people. They raised a standing army of 1 million, and for a decade they fought across much of the mid and lower Yangtze Valley. The war cost as many lives as World War I. It became one of the bloodiest wars in human history, a savage civil war and the largest conflict of the 19th century. At the time, it was believed that 20 to 30 million people died. A recent Chinese study estimated 70 million. The famous British General Gordon, who lost his life in the Sudan a quarter of a century later, was in China at the end of the Opium Wars. He made his reputation leading the fight against the Taipings on behalf of the Chinese government. Chinese Gordon, as he became known, noted the suffering. They are like wolves. The dead lie where they fall, and in some cases are trodden quite flat by passers-by.
Qing government control only 1% of GDP. Next to nothing, basically, run the empire. Well, the Taipings controlled, they control 600 cities and towns. Imagine that. And that alone will take about 90% of Chinese tax revenue from the state.
The genesis of Chinese martial arts has been attributed to the need for self-defense, hunting techniques, and military training in ancient China. Hand-to-hand combat and weapons practice were important in training Chinese soldiers. This concept of self-improvement, the need to flourish, underscores not only martial arts, but the Chinese attitude to life.
It's that cultivation to reach a higher state of being, and the idea that everybody could become a sage, anybody. The notion of being a sage means becoming immortally known as someone who can effectively change the world. So this idea that anybody can be a sage through self-cultivation is what I think is behind the notion of flourishing. And that same cosmology is still in use in China. And so the discipline that we call Qigong or martial arts or Tai Chi, it's all using that same cosmology.
Ever since the Opium Wars, there had been a simmering resentment of an increasing foreign presence in China. And at the end of the 19th century, this exploded with the Boxer Rebellion, an uprising in 1899.
Mainly against Catholic missions who had been very arrogant in their attitudes to Chinese people, which they considered to be inferior.
This was an anti-imperialist, anti-foreign and anti-Christian uprising, initiated by the Militia United in Righteousness. It was known outside China as the Boxer Rebellion because so many of the participants practiced Chinese martial arts, also referred to in the West as Chinese boxing.
The Boxers were some sort of quasi-religious sects who were mobilizing and taking advantage of the rise of frustrations that were directed partly against foreigners but partly also against government authorities, at least to begin with. The Boxers, in a term with 3 Chinese words, they are Yi, He, Tuan, named effectively righteous, harmonious fist. That's how they came about, and that's why they were called the Boxer, is the fist bit of it.
The Boxers felt spiritually possessed and convinced they were invulnerable to foreign weapons, converged on Beijing. Foreigners and Chinese Christians sought refuge.
Suddenly, the Boxers started to make claims that they had divine power. Bullets could not hurt them.
Initially hesitant, the Empress Dowager Cixi supported the Boxers and issued an imperial decree declaring war on the foreign powers.
He was certainly the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. About 50,000 Chinese Christians died. A few hundred Europeans died in this episode of chaos. She was certainly responsible for declaring war against all foreigners.
Diplomats, foreign civilians and soldiers, as well as Chinese Christians in Beijing, were besieged for 55 days by the Imperial Army of China and the Boxers. An 8-nation alliance of Western powers brought 200,000 armed troops to China, defeated the Imperial Army and freed the foreigners. Uncontrolled plunder of the capital and the surrounding countryside ensued, along with the summary execution of those suspected of being Boxers and government officials who had supported them. The Qing dynasty was faced with a huge reparations bill. This had come a few years after another humiliating loss for the Qing in a brief war with Japan over the Korean peninsula. The war exposed the failure of the Qing attempt to modernize its military. The humiliating loss of Korea as a tributary state sparked an unprecedented public outcry.
The Japanese believed that they were the true seat of culture in East Asia. They are the center of the world, not Chinese. But this is certainly not agreed upon by the Chinese because they look at the way Confucianism was passed on to Japan, even social structure, even dress code to Japan. So they believe the Japanese, at the best, got the third-hand Chinese inventions, innovations, including the language, because everything must go through Korea to reach Japan. Now, the Japanese decide to depart from Asia and join Europe in the second half of the 19th century because Japan finally decided China was no longer a qualified teacher or leader for their civilization. So they decided to join the Europeans. They call themselves Europeans in Asia. So they decided to import foreign technology, foreign military, foreign administration, everything. They really fancy the German military, the French military, and also the British military. They hired British gunners on their ships, and the British gunners were the best in the world. I think the Japanese, by playing dirty, really get China repeatedly defeated. Basically, for their credit, they're clever people. The ambition for Japan was to become modern in a small country like Japan with no clear resources. The best way is to run colonization of the rest of Asia. So they did.
In 1905, just 10 years later, the Japanese went on to defeat Russia in a short-lived Russo-Japanese war, adding to their emerging power and influence.
When the Russo-Japanese War was won by the Japanese, Japan became a great model for China because it had defeated a Western power. So Chinese intellectuals who wanted to advance themselves as possible advisors to Chinese governments went west and east to Japan for their education.
For hundreds of years, the Qing had prevented many educated Chinese from leaving the country, even under threat of execution.
Especially for officials, you're not supposed to leave China, or the members of the literati, because you are basically the treasurers of the Confucian teaching, and also you're the pillars of society. But for ordinary people, really, you can smuggle yourself quite easily out of China.
Not only were the Chinese elite leaving the country to seek work abroad, soon Chinese workers would become a source of cheap labour in America, the British Empire and beyond, following the abolition of the slave trade.
Black Africans are certainly politically incorrect, but, Asians are fine. So you sign up for 8 years of your life as an Indian or a Chinese, then you'll be sent to those plantations to replace the black laborers or slaves. So that's the beginning of the overseas Chinese diasporas.
Between 1821 and 1945, about 3 million contract labourers were shipped out of China. Many were press-ganged onto ships and known as coolies.
They were going to work in Peru, they would have enough money to live far better than in China, and they came with contracts to work for about equivalent to $8 a month, of which 4 were subtracted to pay for the sea fare. The labor conditions of the coolies in Peru were appalling, and when they infringed any of the arbitrary rules, they were punished severely. And when they escaped, they were captured, they were branded and put in chains. Nevertheless, they remained and finished their contracts and obtained their liberty and stay in the country as businessmen. After 1874, there were other waves of Chinese that came as free agents. Some of them were friends or relatives of the coolies. Others had heard of Peru, the land of opportunity. Today, the population is about 10 to 15% of the total population of the country.
What we have at the 19th century is a global dispersal of the Chinese around the world, really. In Southeast Asia, they go there through the existing trade links that they are developing themselves and have a huge impact on really developing industry and trade across Southeast Asia, to the extent that they become extremely successful and in many cases, are leaders within the industry in those countries.
There were disproportionately young male, and there were disproportionately the eldest son in the family. And they were sent out to make a little fortune for the rest of the family. Yeah, so in that regard, this is really a family business. Yeah? If you go to West Indies, if you go to California, if you go to Melbourne, if you go to New Zealand, you may actually get rich, although very few actually did.
In Australia, thousands of Chinese arrived in the 1850s, along with many other immigrants from around the world, looking to strike it rich in the gold rush. But they were heavily discriminated against. The government created a head tax and refused the Chinese entry through the port of Melbourne.
They did everything in their power to try and stop the Chinese from coming into Victoria. And they didn't like them because they worked hard and they ate different food, spoke a different language, and lots of different reasons.
The Chinese were forced to disembark at a remote coastal port in South Australia and had to walk hundreds of miles to the goldfields.
The ones that got to the goldfields were only allowed to mine the soil that the Europeans mined and considered useless. And then they put on a £4 residence tax. There was no immigration for Chinese women. And they never lifted those restrictions until 1978.
Despite being ostracised, the Chinese brought change to Australia, including the introduction of market gardening.
If it hadn't been for the pioneering of the market gardening, a lot of those early miners would have died. They wouldn't have had any fresh veggies.
Chinese labourers were also brought into the United States to help construct the Transcontinental Railroad, which linked America's east and west coasts. The labourers were employed in the most difficult and dangerous jobs. Known as powder monkeys, some were used to scale giant rock faces to plant explosives so that tunnels could be built, like this one in California, known as the Chinese Wall.
It's really one of the great engineering achievements in America in the 19th century because this is what's called a dry-laid wall. There is no mortar. These are locked like a jigsaw puzzle, and that's why it's so stable. There was an acute labor shortage of white males in California. A lot of California men had gone to Nevada to search for silver. So they needed labor, and there was a Chinese population. They reluctantly hired them, and they thought, they really can't do anything. They're smaller than us, they're weaker than us, they don't speak our language, they don't know what they're doing, but they were there. And it turned out that the Chinese were such good workers, such fabulous workers, that the railroad began to search all over the western states for Chinese. They even sent contractors to Guangzhou province and brought back shiploads of Chinese. 1,654 feet on 4 faces, nearly 2 years. Winter and summer, working essentially 24 hours a day, just for one tunnel.
Indentured laborer really is very attractive. It's a big sum of money. Only at the end of the term you will get full pay, and that's really it's a saving scheme, right? And this is really the demand side, and you have a huge market, especially in America. And the supply side is you have enough Chinese being able to leave their family farms, yeah, and then go for it.
As well as the significance of the Chinese themselves and the kind of input they put into helping develop these nations, we have a huge backlash against them at that time. For example, in 1882, following the economic slump of the 1870s, there is the Chinese Exclusion Act in the US. In Australia, in 1901, there's brought in the White Australia policy, and even though it's White Australia and aims at a whole range of minorities, it specifically targets the Chinese. During that period, there's this huge peak, I would say, in xenophobia, and this is legitimized by the state. And that, in turn, in terms of what happens on the ground, is that you see a huge surge in anti-Chinese racial violence. We have the construction of particular ideas around Chineseness. So in the 19th century, you have this hugely significant tag called the Yellow Peril, and it's this fear of the Chinese through their migrations going around the world and essentially taking over the world. In addition to that, I think there's a kind of a threat to ideas around civilization. You know, if they come with their different ways and take over our culture, it's going to obliterate somehow our culture as we know it.
Just the word Far East, is very indicative. It's remote, it's kind of mysterious. It's either been, romanticized. You think of chinoiserie, in the time of George III and George IV in Britain and in France and Europe. Kind of idea of China being a place of high culture. And on the other hand, you've got this demonization, what some people have called, the story of Fu Manchu, this character dreamt up by a British-Irish writer in the early 20th century who'd never set foot, in China, and yet imagined, this kind of sinister figure, Dr. Fu Manchu, who then, of course, was played in films rather hilariously by Christopher Lee, who, as far as I could see, had not a trace of Chinese blood in him. So, this has been there a long time, and I guess in the 21st century, it's complemented by the fact that China's politically quite alien. It's the perfect storm, really, this place which has a long history of being othered, and then it's politically, kind of very different too.
In China, at the end of the 19th century, the political crisis deepened. After more than 3,000 years of an unbroken dynastic history, China's great imperial age was coming to an end.
We are looking at systemic decay and failures to meet challenges that were unfolding. With or without the Empress Dowager, the imperial Manchu dynasty would be facing enormous amounts of challenges, and it's questionable whether it would have been able to meet those challenges. Now, the Empress Dowager certainly accelerated the process of the demise of the Qing Empire, partly because she was not delivering the kind of reforms necessary at an earlier time. She only started introducing reforms when it was a bit rather too late, and then it was also a bit too little.
In this moment of crisis for imperial China, the Dowager's Emperor Cixi, the archetypal dragon lady who had ruled China for 47 years and who had sided with the Boxers in their rebellion, was still diverting funds from a fast emptying imperial treasury to build her own summer palace outside Beijing. A World Heritage Site, it is still regarded as a masterpiece of Chinese landscape garden design and would soon be used as a retreat by the incoming Republican government and is used by the communist elite today. The day before she died in 1908, Empress Cixi nominated the 2-year-old Pu Yi to become China's last emperor. But the child emperor was deposed aged 6, just 4 years later, because in 1911, a series of upheavals led to the collapse of China's last imperial dynasty. Under a new leader, Sun Yat-sen, the rebellion culminated in the 1911 Xinhai Revolution. China would now turn westward.
There was a whole system of worker intellectuals who were sent to Europe for education, which included the person whom we now know as the famous Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai, but many, many others who were educated in Paris and other centers in Europe. And the combination of the two was to learn from the West in order to beat the West.
When the end came for China's last imperial dynasty, many Chinese celebrated by having a haircut.
One of the big symbolic changes immediately with the proclamation of the Republic was that people were cutting off their queues. The queues was a hairstyle imposed by the Manchus. It was not a kind of Chinese way of wearing their hair at all. And for the overwhelming majority of people in China, the changes of the government in Beijing was marginal to them.
Next time, the Chinese Republic is born, setting the empire on a course which would descend into civil war, a communist revolution, and a newfound quest that would see China re-emerge into the 21st century, reclaiming its place among the world's great empires.